We're going live now. We are live.
Hello, fellow listeners. Thank you for your return each week to our Socialist Action webcasts. Also, a warm welcome to our first-time listeners and viewers. We have a fantastic and most educational webcast for you tonight that I'm sure you will enjoy. And also, we want your participation. So please, anytime during the show, write your question for the panelists in the chat column. And if you are not already a member of the SA YouTube channel, please do so. It's free. My name is Elizabeth Bice, and I will be your host this evening, along with Daniel Torre, our technical producer. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, known as North America. I am speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Wendat, and Haudenosaunee people in a place called Toronto. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's topic is Back to School, Back to Crisis, featuring Grace Road at the Queen's University, Avril Damija of University of Toronto, and Mike Lawler, a union organizer also at U of T. Grace, Avril, and Mike will each speak for about 10 minutes. After that, we will take questions written into the chat column from our online audience. So let's begin. Grace Road is a student of psychology at Queen's University, currently taking a gap year from studies to focus on putting her beliefs into action. The pandemic has been a period of learning for her, during which she realized how important organized socialist action is. Grace has academic and real-world experience in research, mental health, and working with vulnerable populations. She is passionate about academic writing in the fields of science and philosophy. Welcome, Grace.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So like you mentioned, I've been going to Queen's University for some time. I'm taking a year of just a few courses, so I'm kind of taking a year off now. But in my time at Queen's University, I have had the opportunity to witness the culture there and witness some issues therein. So that's what I'm going to be talking about a bit today. I'm not sure if I'm... Hello?
You're good.
Okay, I'm not sure when it cut out, but basically I'm just going to be talking about the culture on campus at Queen's and more large scale that issue of white elitism in universities and in specific programs in university. So I'm just going to start off with a recent history of some things to highlight the issues that I'm going to be discussing and how bad the culture can manifest in certain behaviors and actions that have been occurring even just in the past 5 years. I think these are all within. So I think one of the most recent ones was over Zoom. So this was in 2021. And we had a guest lecturer come on and they were talking to, I think it was about 200 students and staff. And then at the end of this, they were hacked and racist and also anti-Semitic messaging and images, including swastikas and other incredibly hateful visionary things were all presented, and it was forced upon many students, including students who were Jewish in the crowd, who said that they were very traumatized by the actions and the guest lecturer themselves. So that was one of the most recent ones. No one was found guilty of doing that, and no one was punished for that. There was also 3 racist themed parties in the past few years, the most recent of which after the spread of coronavirus, where business students tried to appear Chinese and had a China themed party. Then there was also to the 2015 and 2016 racist themed parties where people had teams and they would dress up as stereotypes of different ethnicities. So those are just a few examples of some of the more newsworthy items that have come out of Queens specifically, but they're just kind of the tip of the iceberg of how the culture has created very bad experiences for many students. And particularly dangerous can be the Indigenous experience on culture, and obviously in Canada in general. So in Canada specifically, in 2019, there was an anti-Semitic and racist graffitis that was displayed all across the sidewalk, and many students saw that before it was cleaned up. Also, I don't think any students were ever found guilty of that. October the same year, a violent poem that was threatening racist and homophobic violence was posted in an Indigenous and Allies community area in their res, so where these people actually live. And no one was ever found guilty of that. And Indigenous flags are also repeatedly torn down from the Indigenous Student Center. So in the words of an Indigenous student that was going to Queens for, I think, 2 years before that year took place where all three of those incidents occurred, she said that Indigenous students have been so unsupported during this time, and it just adds another layer on top of university, which is already crazy stressful and busy. And then additionally, to support that maybe the school hasn't been doing what it could to support these students, the full residence dawn team only had 1 or 2 hour long meetings, and a residence dawn stated that they spent the same amount of time talking about the incidents as the Australian wildfires at the time. They didn't talk about what actions they would do to ensure it didn't happen again, how to support the students in the future, or the root of the issue, and they never actually addressed preventative measures. That was in the words of the Dawn there at the time. Essentially, I think it was October 18th that nearly 1,000 students in protest and in support of Indigenous and LGBTQ+ students walked out, and it was hosted by Four Directions, which is the Indigenous Support Community Center on campus. After this was done, attention was obviously brought to the issue and to the support the students needed. However, I want to bring attention to the way that this was handled because it highlights larger issues in the culture of the university at whole, not even just specifically the original incident. So what they were asking for was a more safe place for Indigenous students to go. And they specified that they did not want this to include police because police and campus security are not equivalents to safety for obviously many populations, including Indigenous people. So regardless of this, after the attention was brought, especially from different national news stories to the incident, the response was to bring in the KPD or the Kingston Police and bring more security personnel to their specific, I think it was Chown, but their specific residence hall. And there was many racialized students' concerns regarding these security services and the law enforcement's treatments of their marginalized community that was very outspoken. However, for that entire year, the response and the only response that was given to increase the safety of these students was increasing the security patrols for them. So this is highlighting a larger issue of police culture and how this feeds into the white elitism on culture in schools in general. So, for example, our police service in Kingston was the subject of the first racial profiling study of police department in Canada, revealing the troubling statistics about the treatment of racialized populations in Kingston. And many people are aware of this history, obviously, and are very are in a state of tension on campus, being so close to not only the police station, but also being in the prison, I forgot the word prison, in the prison capital of Canada. So we actually have 3 prisons around our campus, at least, that are functioning. And then we also have a large police department. So this creates lots of feelings of unsafety in students on campus. And when the response to issues of these communities are faced with further perpetration by the police, it shows that there's not being much done to understand where these people are coming from and the best ways to support them. So, as stated by an anonymous student in the Queen's Gazette, in the past 2 years, they had seen Queen students come together to achieve amazing feats because there is a lot of activism on campus that I've witnessed as well. So we've made tangible push toward divestment from fossil fuels, and then also last summer marked a momentous push for the affirmation of Black rights and recognition of the discrimination that faced by the Black community at Queen's. Unfortunately, even in recognizing such movements, there's a clear pattern of accepting only palatable movements or palatable ways of facing concerns. And the way that this student brought that forth in evidence was any advocacy for controversial issues, for example, such as Palestine recently, has been largely silenced and not addressed by campus. Two things are usually noticed in responses made by universities to issues of equity and diversity. And the first is that it's only made when absolutely necessary by the public demands. And two, it's only usually done with performative intent. There's not usually even an address of the systemic issues, let alone a plan moving forward past a call and response to the certain events that are taking place. And I wanted to also draw attention to a pattern of which programs these things are occurring in, because it is an issue across all schools and across all universities, but specifically in certain prestigious programs and prestigious universities, or programs or institutions which pride themselves on those things. It is a much larger issue. So for example, we have the Commerce Smith Business School on campus, and that is where a lot of these issues are coming out of. That is what was hosting all of the racist parties that I mentioned, and also where a lot of students are reporting racist events occurring to them. So as a former Queen's student put it, the program prides itself on being the premier business school and prestigious. And what this really means is elitist and white elitist, insofar that opportunities to travel and see and appreciate another culture is even treated as a stupid game of superiority versus inferiority. So this is in reference to a guest lecturer that had come in and spoken about their travels and had mentioned where this student's hometown was and had referenced that town as being run down or dingy, and that it wasn't too bad because at least there was a good, I think it was spa there. So just horribly offensive things about this person's hometown that were never addressed, and just immediately made this student feel like there was a culture of not addressing or not even noticing microaggressions such as those within the faculty and the supported people by the university, not only just students themselves. So moving forward and what can be done, one thing that has been mentioned that is relevant to that story in particular is that there is currently no bias training for any faculty or any guest speakers coming to campus. There is nothing really being done to screen them for any of these equity and diversity issues that could look at people who are coming with maybe not the best intent or not the best effect on certain populations of students. So an easy way that we could address this, and that hasn't been mentioned by the university, is to, one, make implicit bias training mandatory for all faculty on campus, and two, turning to students, make EDI education inherent to courses. So especially in certain programs that they've had a history of these events, like our business programs and programs such as those. Teaching even the basic university guidelines as a mandatory part of class, alongside critical race theory and the background of the university and the harmful effects the university has had on its community, as well as teaching things such as stereotype threat, which is the negative effect that marginalized communities can experience during testing when surrounded by many people of basically when surrounded by a lot of white people, because they're reminded of stereotypes that are likely held by a lot of their peers. And unfortunately, this can result in worse performance on their part because of the anxiety caused by all of those peers and their opinions. So even teaching about something like this has been shown in research to reduce its effect on students. And regardless of this proof, it's never been taught or mandated in any course other than psychology courses. So the next step that we can do is to hold perpetrators accountable. And this is not necessarily to endorse punitive justice of any kind, but it's the fact that we have had many perpetrator students accountable for many different crimes on campus and many different issues on campus. However, these ones, it seems like the pattern is very much how the university is viewed in the news specifically, and how easily it can be swept under the rug. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of work going into investigation. And when that's happening, it's telling other students that they can get away with it, which is showing by the repeat pattern of offending that's occurring here. And then lastly, we need to address the racial makeup of the population in the university. So there's many ways we can do this in specific universities, and Queen's itself, there are different solutions I could suggest. But overall, white elitism in private education is a much larger issue than any one institution, as we know. And so much larger issues such as socioeconomic barriers should probably be addressed in that discussion before any particular policies for Queens in particular are suggested. But those are the main issues that I see as contributing to the culture there. And then the Instagram accounts that I wanted to bring attention to are Stolen by Smith and Smith Black Business. So as I'm mentioning, specific programs that that are the site of a lot of racist and anti-Indigenous issues. There's also a lot of activism happening in those areas by students, and a lot of effort being done to have those voices heard. So one thing that happened this summer that was unfortunate was White Business, or White Smith Business, at Queen's, and it was basically an account started by white students that wanted a safe space for white students to talk about white issues in business. So while that was horrible, the response to it was Smith Black Business. And after that account was shut down, this account has been continuing to run. And it aims to provide a space for Black students in the commerce program that is both safe and welcoming, in which they can learn and grow. And it's been doing a great job of sharing success stories and history and helping to shed light on that on campus. And then also Stolen by Smith, which is an account that shares student experiences with acts of racism and discrimination at the Smith School of Business. So this, I think, started up last year, and in its first week of opening, it already shared 200 posts that students have sent in just for Smith School of Business at Queen's, their stories of facing racism. So anyways, these have been really good ways to show students on campus that maybe aren't aware of what's happening, what is happening, and hopefully they turn our eyes towards the what we can be done portion that I referenced. Yeah, that's all I have.
Okay, thank you very much, Grace. Now we'll move to our next panelist, Avril Damija. He is also a student of U of T, studying philosophy, and he's from India. As an international student, he is paying 8 times the tuition fee of a Canadian enrolled at that university. Avril is an active member of SMASH and Socialist Action. Welcome, Avril.
Hello. I'm going to guess you guys can hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So yeah, pretty much that. As Elizabeth mentioned, I'm an international student. I'm in my second year at U of T, and I'm doing philosophy and international relations. And yeah, what I want to talk about today was just the absurdity of international tuition for students coming to Canada who aren't like Canadian citizens. So in my first year economics course, we were taught about this basic strategy of private firms called price discrimination. Simply put, it's when a firm can charge customers different prices for the same good or service based on the unique needs of the customer. I paid $56,000 to learn that on a Zoom call 13,000 kilometers away. The Canadian student I used to study with paid $7,500. Make no mistake, we were both grossly overcharged, but the varying degrees of exploitation displays a fundamental flaw with public universities across North America. While my economics class was really boring and it made me want to like drop out of the major entirely and switch to philosophy like a month ago, I was able to meet dozens of other students in a similar situation as me. And at this moment, 2021, I think U of T made $3 billion in revenue last year. $1 billion of that was represented through international tuition. That's like 30%. And our tuition just keeps going up. I mean, this year from $56,000, it went up to $60,000. And why is the university allowed to get away with this blatant con of a tuition system? It's because the government lets them. It sets limits and intervenes with their own funding for domestic students through things like OSAP and, you know, more accessible government loans or their own like scholarships and grants, while it double whammies us with the additional cost of traveling and adjustment to living in Canada, along with this scam of a tuition system. An argument I've often heard from conservative types in my political science classes is that if you don't want to pay the higher fees, just don't move here. Just stay back in India and get my post-secondary degree over there. So even if we ignore the obvious empiric benefits of immigration to Canada, especially for Canada, a country with an aging population, the argument still has like numerous different flaws. For one, countries in Asia and Africa present significantly lower earning potentials for a lot of people. One could argue that a middle-class life here in Canada, as traditionally defined in terms of income, would still have a higher standard of living than an upper-class life, again, determined by standards of income, in a lot of countries in the Eastern Hemisphere, which represents the largest proportion of student immigrants. I mean, after all, only upper-class, upper-income bracket students are going to be able to afford to pay $56,000 a year to study outside of India. So the quality of education also leaves a lot to be desired, especially in rapidly industrializing countries in Asia, like India. I mean, we're excellent at training engineers, we're excellent at training doctors, and not much else. You can't really blame us too. I mean, for most of modern history, India was extremely agrarian, rural, and underdeveloped. I mean, after decades of colonialism, famine, and occupation, developing a holistic education system that provides you with the mobility and freedom of a Western-style education hasn't been on the government's priorities. Our style of education echoes our past needs. Our education system is brutal, it's fast-paced, it's extremely rigorous with no scope of electives or course shopping, and it gets the two things an industrializing nation needs the most, engineers and doctors, very quickly. But that also means that most of us others who don't want to imagine lives for us in those fields have to look elsewhere for our further education. For example, Canada. But oh no, look at that. The tuition I have to pay is as much as 10 years worth of median wages in India. It would be dishonest of me to argue this from the position of a majority of Indians. The truth is, I've had a fairly privileged upbringing, which is why I'm able to talk about stuff like this in Toronto. I'm able to hop on Zoom calls with my laptop, and I do have a lot of access. But something to remember is that not everyone who comes to school at U of T is moving here permanently. A lot of people plan to study here and then use their education to get better jobs back home. And I think that presents another flaw. All of these people who are planning to study here are also like me. They're already privileged, and they're the ones getting access to this higher standard of education at the expense of people back in India who have to stick with something which I can obviously say has a lower standard of education. So it's privileged people getting a privileged education, and that leads them to have the highest reward jobs back in India. I mean, if education is an agent for income mobility, it doesn't really hold up when that income mobility device is locked behind a $50,000 key. I think this is a point we can relate to with Canadian students as well. I mean, again, it's a fact that even domestic tuition has been rising pretty rapidly. And my worry is that the university may see this domestic tuition rise as another reason to charge international students more. I know that in the university's current financial plans, it's always been that you can supplement subsidies for domestic students through the revenue you gain from international students. This has been happening year on year for the last 20 years, I think. So the free choice that's presented to international students in terms of, okay, you can study in India or you can come over here, it's up to you. If you don't want to pay the tuition, you don't have to come over here. It's not often as free as people lead you to believe. It's not such a simple binary. And we can't even really vote with our dollars and choose not to come, because that would guarantee a worse outcome for us in the near future. Like I said, the standard of education in India for fields outside of engineering and medicine aren't at the same level as they are in Western style education systems. So the solution is for the government to fund public education entirely. It's for education for everyone, regardless of its citizenship, to be free. That way, the university no longer has any need to cover their costs for domestic students with revenue from international students. Everyone's cost is being subsidized. And the nonsensical idea of two people paying different amounts to learn the same boring definitions can go out the window with that. So yeah, that was pretty much it. It's a fairly small topic, fairly niche topic, but I do believe, I mean, at this point in 2021, it's affecting maybe like 20,000 students at U of T and even more across Canada. So I do believe it has to be discussed, and that's why I'm happy to do this. Thank you.
Thank you, Avril. Okay, we move to our next panelist. Mike Lawler is a PhD student at the University of Toronto. His work engages with street food vending in Thailand, but he is also more broadly interested in issues of food sovereignty, agriculture, and market infrastructures, and food security issues throughout university campuses. He has worked at Chestnut Residence for 3 years and been involved with a number of organizing and advocacy efforts, particularly around the areas of food and labor. Outside of his studies, he helps to organize several farmers markets in Toronto and volunteers with Community Food Centres Canada. Welcome, Mike.
Yeah, thanks very much. I didn't realize that whole intro was going to be read, so I might have made it a bit shorter. But I appreciate you having me on and following Grace and Avril. It was really nice to hear what they've been up to. So I'm going to speak a little bit about two of the kind of bigger issues from last year. So one of them was a unionization campaign that myself and another number of other students led. And the other issue I'm going to speak about is kind of related to food provisioning on campus and particularly affordable food. So I have worked at the residence for 2.5 years at this point, going on 3 years. Last year was incredibly challenging in terms of working in a residence space during COVID. So we went from having about 1,100 students to having 300. And in addition to that kind of drop, we saw a huge range of issues with student mental health. The kind of already long-standing issues with suicidal ideations, depression, generalized depression, anxiety disorders, et cetera, were made all the more challenging and all the more impactful through COVID. So as kind of resident staff, we had a particularly challenging year last year, which actually led us to kind of consider unionizing. This was kind of a easy decision to make because largely the majority of the staff didn't feel supported in the position. So, similar to Avril talking about how much money the university is kind of bringing in, the residence that I work at is particularly geared towards international students. So many of these students are international engineering students. They're paying $60,000 to $70,000 a year just in tuition. So we saw a number of these students that were struggling pretty mightily. And as staff, we weren't really able to kind of help them. And we, eventually kind of through raising our concerns with various levels of administration, decided that we actually had to bring our concerns to a kind of unionization process. So we kind of did that quite quickly at the end of the year. I think we had about a month left. So it was a 3-week process altogether. We had 97% of our staff voting in favor of unionization. And we, alongside 6 other residences, essentially voted to unionize. So yeah, I think that's, if you look at kind of collective action and working in unison, that was a fairly high number of student staff that basically voted to kind of join that union movement. The second piece that I was pretty actively involved with last year was campaigning against the introduction of a declining balance model in our food hall. So historically, Chestnut Residence since 2003, its inception year, has operated on a kind of all you care to eat model, which has basically meant that students could eat whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. Last year, due to COVID-19 and the desire to make more money, increase profits, the residents implemented a declining balance model. Alongside this declining balance model, we quickly did the math and determined that students had about $21 to $24 a day to spend on food. We were often seeing students spending between $30 to $50 per day. So within the first month, we were already realizing that students were going to run out of money. And we launched a number of campaigns, both with kind of traditional media sources. We did a boycott. We did a number of kind of letter writing campaigns and petitions to basically lobby food services at University of Toronto to kind of eliminate some of the more egregious price gouging measures, but also to reduce the kind of prices more generally. So we saw quite a kind of number of our policy suggestions implemented, which was quite good. And we're continuing to kind of do that work actively across multiple residences this year as well. If you're interested in that work, you can read a little bit about it on Let's Talk Food U of T. That's our Instagram. And I'm obviously gonna speak a bit more about it later. So yeah, basically the two kind of facets that I was involved with last year mostly were organizing the union drive at Chestnut Residence alongside a number of other students, and working in kind of food advocacy to ensure food affordability and kind of food security for all students.
Okay, are you through, Michael?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty quick
Okay, I
overview.
didn't, okay, sure. I didn't know if there was an interruption. Sorry about that, because sometimes we have a technical problem. Okay, so now we're going to go back to our technical producer, Daniel, and he will put 3 questions, which I think he's done so already, in the chat column. And we will have 6 minutes each to answer 1, 2, or 3 questions. And we will start with Avril and then go to Michael and then to Grace. So Avril, you're up first.
So I need to read the questions first, Elizabeth.
Oh,
So
I'm sorry, Daniel, because they were up so early. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no worries.
Go ahead.
For the sake of the audience. So first question, what is your vision of policing, not by the corporate and colonial state, but by workers, students, and racialized people? The second question is, student unions are sometimes attacked as being corrupt, not unlike the attacks levied against worker unions. What work is there to be done within our student unions so that they fight for students? And then the third question is, with students only at school for 4 years on average, how can we build the organizations and institutional memory necessary to challenge the university bureaucracy?
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I apologize to our audience for that. So now we will go to our panelists. They can answer 1, 2, or 3 questions. And we will start with Avril, and then we will go to Michael, and then to Grace. And you have 6 minutes each to answer 1, 2, or 3. Avril?
Okay, I don't think I'll need 6 minutes, but I would like to tackle question 3 because that is something that I have thought about myself for quite a while now. And I think that there is an effective way you can do this. For example, you can create, so it starts with creating a system that's really easy to join, right? Everything is set up like a framework, so you don't have to start everything from the ground up every year. If you have a certain like system that people can just fit into and then just keep working on what you were already working on, one person graduating isn't going to be a big deal. So stuff like, how can you do that? You can do stuff like outreach, podcasts, journaling, writing in, like, for example, the varsity at U of T, stuff like that. That leaves physical evidence of the stuff that your organization has been working on for years on hand. And I've actually been trying to do this with the college I'm a part of, University College, for a few months now, where we've been trying to put together a podcast which talks about equity issues on campus. And we gather a lot of evidence. We gather interviews, and then we get in touch with professors and student unions on campus. And that creates contacts for future episodes and future podcasts. So that way I know that next year, if I don't have the time to do this podcast, it would not be a big problem for someone new, a second year in 2022, to fit right into this framework and take the burden forward. And they already have an idea of what we have been doing through this like list of sources, and they can just keep it going. I think that if you have like a working system and a working list of sources for your system, that can probably help you to hit the ground running. Yeah.
Okay, Michael.
Perfect. I moved inside because it's a bit cold outside. So I'd like to tackle question number 3, I think, because it's actually something I've been thinking of quite a lot throughout the past year. So after the year I had last year in terms of working at the residence, one of the last things I wanted to do was return. There were huge issues with the kind of systemic approach of the university in terms of dealing with student mental health, in terms of responding to staff concerns. We actually didn't even have proper PPE up until I actually had to refuse work and file a formal complaint. So that was actually the kind of only thing that forced the employer to actually bring in masks and other kind of PPE equipment. So I think you're kind of getting the idea that it was a very challenging year. But one of the things that I was often thinking about was that I wanted to come back for this year to ensure that the work that we had started with the unionization campaign, so in particular, the kind of finalizing of a contract and the bargaining process, but also the kind of institutional memory and ensuring that that was passed on to future generations. So as bad as this may sound, sometimes I think it's a matter of sacrifice. You have to kind of continue in positions until you can ensure that that institutional memory is protected and preserved. And there's obviously inherent privilege with being able to kind of do that for some groups, but for me, that was a big piece was even if I didn't necessarily want to return or want to fully return to the position, this was the only way that I could ensure that the work that we had done and the kind of efforts to encourage students to be more kind of equity minded and a little bit more radical in terms of their approaches to the institution could be kind of sustained, maintained, and built upon. So yeah, for me, it was quite personal. I decided to come back to the position. There were only 5 out of 22 staff that were actually returning from the year prior. So in terms of that institutional memory, it's quite easy to wipe out. The other thing for resident spaces, which is particularly interesting, is that they actually do not typically have students there for more than 1 year. So if you have a kind of negative policy, you can actually typically kind of work it through the system. And within a year or two, anyone who had memory of what it used to be previously actually has no memory left anymore. So it's important to kind of have the staff have that kind of institutional memory, because often for students and residents, it's usually only one, maximum 2 or 3 years that they're there. The music is a little bit loud. Can people still hear me or? Yeah, okay, awesome. So yeah, those are kind of big pieces. I think the other kind of work that we did, we created a power map. So we mapped how kind of power was distributed and executed throughout the various kind of departments that we were engaging with at the university. So that's quite helpful in terms of institutional memory, because when we leave and we move on to other kind of positions or opportunities, the incoming staff can actually understand how power operates in the university. And I think Grace probably has kind of similar experiences. There's often a level of opacity with how the university operates, and in particular, the kind of non-academic staff are particularly insulated from kind of dealing with student concerns. So there's often kind of layers of bureaucracy or administration between who's actually making the decision and who's actually, you know, speaking to these decisions or handling student concerns. So power mapping was a big one for us, and also just making alliances across different campus groups.
Okay, thank you. Grace?
Yeah, so I think I'll do a bit of just the first and the third one. I think those were already great answers. Like for the third one, a lot was already said. But I think, so in terms of building that continuity when you have such a large turnover in student body, I think it's good to, first of all, have specific organizations in place. In terms of like turning ideology into action. There's a lot of like buildup of students wanting to do things and wanting change to be seen, but all of the change that we see historically happening in universities can be traced back to organized bodies of activism. So in terms of clubs I've been a part of or activism groups I've been a part of, the way that that's been handled is that there's been layers to it. So we have the larger body of students who have that usual 4-year turnover. But then behind that, we also have the executive committee, which is comprised of these students, but specifically students who have been in the club a few years and are familiar with the policy of the club. And then behind that, there is the community level, which is including alum who are in the community, as well as people who've been in the organization, such as students who are maybe in longer programs, or people who live in the community permanently, or faculty as well. So all more long-term people, and those people work in tandem with the executive committee, which is more familiar with the student body and with the ongoings in the policy, and they ensure that continuity behind while there's all that turnover happening, all those changes are being implemented in terms that can be traced in terms of policy and written policy, and also all the initiatives aren't losing steam as people pick and drop them off, because we can have organized ways and roles delegated to having them continue even when we lose people. And secondly, I think the way that we can create the long-term change is, again, through policy change, but in terms of what I was mentioning, education. I think as in particular, universities are a place of education, it makes sense to be the best way that we fight any of the issues arising in education to be through education. And I think that including those implicit bias trainings and EDI education as compulsory items for students and making that a part of our overall education is what would make honestly the largest difference. And even just from personal experience, speaking with students and noticing the difference of when someone doesn't know something about campus culture, and then when they do, even just the very different stances people take after learning things, I think speaks for itself. And then for the first question, policing, I think it's a difficult question just depending on your definition of policing. If it's the definition of like state sanctioned violence policing, I wouldn't say I like necessarily condone that in any institution or any forum. And I don't know what way we could organize that around being for the workers or for marginalized people. But if we're looking at that in terms of like, what is the threat that you're waging against people? I think there are other ways we could look at it in terms of policing, in terms of like harm reduction, in which case I absolutely do believe in it. And we actually have a lot of things that I think would fit that definition already on campus, such as like walk home groups, which are designated for walking people home at night. And coming to get people when they're uncomfortable or think that they might be in danger. We have lots of mutual aid on campus, not necessarily run by the university, but by students. And then we also have policing within institutions on campus, like, for example, dons. Being a don, you have point systems and demerit systems that you work with people who are living in those communities. And then finally, I think that it's important to like remember the role of the institution, and the role of the university is not necessarily to wield violence or have that threat against students, but as the role is to give education. I think the biggest threat they have is academic penalties. So if there is any form of policing on campus, I think it should come in the form of investigation, like further investigation. When I say that I wanted further like justice being done, I think they should figure out what was going on. But then in terms of penalties, I think that should be wielded in terms of academics and not in terms of more like traditional policing.
Okay. Thank you, Grace. Okay, we're going to go back to Daniel for 3 more questions. Daniel?
Yeah, great responses. Looking forward to what y'all have to say about these next 3 questions. First one, while students experience a great amount of stress and wish to organize collectively to overcome that, the University of Toronto Students' Union at the St. George campus does not allow students to run teams or slates in their elections. Why is this so, and what can be done about that? The second question is, what kind of support is there today for mass student strikes for free tuition? Quebec students have been willing to strike to reduce tuition. Do you think that can happen here? And the third question is, in Ontario, the neoliberal agenda of Mike Harris and the progressive conservatives in the 90s slashed funding for post-secondary education. As a result, our colleges and universities are run more like corporations. How do students and workers challenge this model?
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, so each panelist will have up to 7 minutes to answer 1, 2, or 3 questions, and we will start with Mike, then go to Grace, and then to Avril. Mike?
Fantastic. So I'm going to tackle questions 2 and 3. I don't feel like I'm well versed enough to tackle number 1. I organized a small boycott of the dining hall last year. So as part of the kind of advocacy to lower food prices, we encourage all students to avoid the dining hall for an entire day across multiple residences. In exchange, we basically prepared nearly 1,000 meals for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for all of these kind of students that were not using the dining hall. And that was actually quite a kind of powerful message. It was very challenging to get students to kind of buy into that concept. Many students are coming into university. They may come from particular kind of political backgrounds or familial backgrounds where organization or organized labor isn't necessarily a reality. So I think the kind of big piece is that there isn't necessarily, in my opinion, the overwhelming support for student strikes in Ontario. The kind of political culture is very different to that of Quebec. But I think once you start to kind of introduce this concept to students and, provide them agency and allow them to understand that they can have an impact on the institution that they live, work, and study in, then I think that demand starts to grow, right? And I think one of the brilliant things about kind of Quebecois or Quebec student movements is that they have never lost that notion that they can make an impact. Whereas in particular at the University of Toronto, because the class sizes are so large and students often feel that kind of they've been, numbered and basically kind of categorized in a mechanical way, they don't necessarily understand that they can have an impact. But last year we saw a number of changes that came out of us organizing. And once you kind of start to have one particular movement that's successful, people start to also buy into it, and that actually gains kind of other support and solidarity. So I think it can happen here. I think we're probably a far ways away from what is typically the case in Quebec. I think that that would be my answer for number 2. In terms of the third question, this is a challenging one. I think that I often grapple with this as someone kind of on the left politically, in terms of it's difficult to come through with new ideas if you're facing a kind of centrist or right-wing agenda that typically wants to focus on austerity or kind of cost control measures, in which kind of everything is economically rationalized. So without kind of buying into that idea, I think it is important to kind of, if we're going to break out of the corporate model, we also have to ensure that we're providing a kind of grounded, I don't want to say like fully costed, but like a feasible model, right? And if that means increased taxation, if that means corporate taxation, whatever that case is, I think that has to be a discussion as well. Because to kind of, break out of the corporate model, which I generally agree that most of the universities in Ontario and Canada more broadly are operating on this corporate model, we also have to ensure that we're coming with these kind of ideas that can inspire people, and that can also, gain broad support. And I don't think it's a matter of kind of coming into the center. I think it's often a matter of inspiring people, again, to kind of reconsider the university. But I think the other piece, and Daniel, how am I on time? Perfect. I think the other piece in terms of challenging the kind of neoconservative movement of Harris and the Conservative Party more broadly is also to inspire or to challenge the professors, both tenured, largely tenured faculty and administrators that are operating in the university. So if you look at the kind of rise of non-academic positions across post-secondary schools, I think they've risen fourfold in the past 20 years. So there's been a lot of administrators that are coming into the university space. And it's not that they're not doing good work, but often they also buy into this kind of corporate model. They're coming from business schools, they're coming from MBAs. So they bring in this kind of corporate ideology. So I think part of, if we're to kind of challenge this model, both as students and workers, it's also to challenge those positions and the people that are in them, because they're bringing particular ideologies which, enact and reenact and reproduce this corporate and corporatization of university spaces. We saw it in the dining hall last year. All of a sudden, despite the fact that U of T has had a bottled water ban since 2011, we saw bottled water in our dining hall. We see it, Avril was talking about tuition. That's a great example of the way in which the university is operating totally as a corporate actor. And, it's deemed a public institution, but really what they're doing is private commerce, where you can charge people whatever you want and whatever the market will bear. I have colleagues and friends that work in recruitment, and basically the kind of ethos of the university is, and I've worked in recruitment myself, is that until international recruitment starts to decline, the fees will continue to increase. Right. So if you think about that particular approach, it's like the most vicious form of free market thinking applied across the university spectrum, inequitably, often with students who are racialized coming from other countries. So, if we're going to talk about kind of equity, diversity, part of it is also starting to challenge this corporate model and the ways in which the university treats disparate or different groups of people.
Okay, Grace?
So I also don't think I can probably speak to the first one. The second one, just really a brief point, but I don't know much about the support that is there. I just know that when I have striked as a student, we've never been able to secure any kind of support in terms of like if there was an assignment that day, or if there was a class where even like all of the students would be missing for a very popular march. It doesn't matter. Like if it's a school hour, it's a school hour, and there's not a lot of support for striking that I've experienced in Ontario. And then for the third one, so it's very difficult to think about how we can challenge the corporate model in terms of, I mean, the larger answer is decommodification of education, but how to get there and the steps that students can take are kind of difficult to visualize, because I think that Michael was also speaking a bit to this, but basically there's that supply and demand aspect, but there's really like an inelastic demand on most parts. There's not someone that's going to look at university and think, if that university is not doing with my money what I want them to be, or if it's an unreasonable amount, then I just won't go to university. Because for a lot of people, it's a privilege to even be able to secure that degree that's going to hopefully set them up for a better future. So knowing this, universities do charge whatever they want, and they set up a very obvious corporate model that students are becoming very aware of. I feel there's a shift in like that collective consciousness of, okay, we're being ripped off for sure. Or maybe I'm just getting like older and now I'm realizing that we're getting ripped off. But I'm noticing that everyone kind of knows there's an issue, but doesn't really see within their control a way to challenge that issue on an individual level in terms of the money that they're supplying to that corporate model. So in the meantime, what I think we can do, regardless of those large scale changes, are to at least recognize in the corporate model that as money is what holds power, following that trail of money and where it's coming from and where it's going to, where we do hold control and where our number one priorities are, is our first thing to do. And that was very abstract. So for an example, I know that we were doing a lot of work tracing money at Queen's. And one of the things we were looking at was for climate change, what we should be divesting from and what we were contributing to. And after we did that, our Queen's Backing Climate Action Group was able to influence them enough that we had protests, we had lots of action going on for that entire year, and they actually did divest from what we were asking them to from oil corporations. So in that term, I think it wasn't necessarily a large scale moving away from the corporate model in any way, but it was at least understanding the corporate model in order to see where our power lies within it. So I think that's a good first step. And I don't know past that, but I think that large scale, obviously, decommodifying education. That's all I have.
Elizabeth, you're currently muted if you're trying to speak, but we're going to Avril next.
Yes.
So Avril, go ahead.
Yes.
Hey, so I think Grace and Michael covered like those points pretty well. So I won't really repeat. On the first question though, like just the specifics of running slates in the elections. I mean, a few months ago when there were elections in the UTSU, this was something we talked about in our like small group of organized students on campus, about how we were trying to run some candidates in a slate. And then when they found out that there was a harsh ban on running together, that could even lead to your entire nomination being dropped, that idea quickly dissipated. I do think that idea, that the whole concept of running in slates is something the university should allow. I was doing some research on this, and apparently 3 or 4 years ago was the last year they were allowed to run in slates. But before that, it was a pretty common thing. Students would get together in little groups and form like a team of 8 people, 7 people to fill up all the exec positions, and then they would run together, boosting each other's platforms. I'm not particularly sure when or why it stopped, but yeah, that would be a very good idea for getting organization on campus, because in a university as big as U of T, there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of students who share similar ideas. And having something like a slate for elections would be the best way to get all those ideas together in one place on one popular platform, which, yeah, that's 100% beneficial for. And even if that comes at the cost of like conservative types organizing together, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because I do think that in terms of the validity of ideas, especially on a college campus in an academic environment, ideas of progressivism is like, left-wing ideas do tend to usually come on top. So I'm not really worried of that angle either. So I think running in slates is probably something universities should look into. I'll leave question 2 and 3 to as Grace and Michael answered it, because I think they covered it very well. And I wasn't in Canada for when the progressive conservatives kind of slashed all the budgets in Toronto for education. So let's step out from that one.
Okay, thank you, Avril. All right, so going back to our producer, I think is it one last question we have, Daniel?
We have 3 questions for one last round of questions.
Okay, wonderful.
So the first question is, at Western University in Atlanta, in Atlantic, Canada campuses, there have been several instances of sexual assault that's led to these big rallies, which led to mass demonstrations led by female and trans students. How can sexism best be confronted and defeated on campuses? The second question is, in the last election, Elections Canada did not operate voting booths on campuses, which led to mass student disenfranchisement. How can students fight for their democratic rights? Should the voting age be lowered? And the third question is, many universities and colleges are invested in infrastructure projects that undermine Indigenous self-determination and or threaten environmental destruction. Grace already alluded to this. What are the demands that ought to be brought forward, and how do students organize around this?
Okay, so we're going to go back, and Grace, you will be first, Avril, and then Mike, and you have up to 6 minutes to answer 1, 2, or 3. Grace?
Yeah, I'll start with the first one. So for this, I think that the issue is obviously large-scale rape culture and how that's brought out in university due to impulsivity, being young, also alcohol, all those factors, but it's all bringing out the manifestations of rape culture. So I think that the way to best address sexism is to be looking from a student's perspective and from what is in your control there. It's about addressing the things that contribute to that culture in day-to-day conversations and in day-to-day culture, calling things out and learning so that you're aware of what should be called out and what things can contribute to. Because again, I think ignorance is always one of the largest evils. And I think that if we did invest in something like mandatory education, we have like mandatory things for first-year students that do address rape culture, but they're not mandatory at all. And the entire audience was women when I went. So I think that in a way that it is acknowledged that that should be happening, and then the execution is just not there. I think it comes from putting that pressure on and keeping the dedication to that mandatory aspect of it, so that in different classes, when we're actually being taught course content and things that we're taught we need to pay attention to, we're also paying attention to the things that are contributing to the culture around us. And while we're being taught about how to address racism and how to seek it out, I think we can also be taught what to look for in rape culture and how we can address that ourselves. On the larger scale, outside of our own control, I think that, again, we need to be holding those, I say crimes is a hard and weighted term, but the harmful actions that are being occurred, I think that when other harmful actions are occurred, there is obviously a difference in pattern behind how they are pursued and how easily they are swept under the rug. And I think that that also needs to be addressed on a larger power scale. I'm not 100% sure about my answer for number 2. I do agree that it made it much more difficult to vote. And I think that if we do want to have young people coming out to vote, if that is a focus, it was a horrible decision and it made little sense. So the third one, and that is the one that I can probably speak a bit more to, is that in order to, I kind of spoke about this before, but I think that one thing is that a lot of students are not aware of the way that their money is being contributing to a larger institution and how that larger institution is then influencing issues that they're personally involved in. So there are a lot of people that are very outspoken and very passionate personally about issues such as Indigenous self-determination and environmental preservation. However, I think there is sometimes a gap in our knowledge of how we're contributing to, as young people, to the larger structures that we don't necessarily always see in our day-to-day. And so that's been a real wake-up call even for myself in recent years, learning that if I'm putting my money in certain purchases towards environmentally conscious decisions, but then putting my money towards a larger institution that is investing huge numbers into oil, how much of a change is that going to cause in one sector of my life, and how can I direct my energy towards that larger scale sector? And in directing that energy, I think it's all about organizing. The only way that I've personally seen change being made around my school has been around marches and protests and striking and bringing lots of attention to issues and bad press and the possibility of bad press. So I think it's about seeking out where and how your institution or your university is contributing to those large scale issues, And then that awareness, bringing it to everyone's awareness, sharing it with as many people as you can, and getting that anger and that pushback against it. And while this is obviously not always going to be successful, it is a start and an encouraging way to start organizing, which then could be successful.
Thank you, Grace. Avril?
So I'd actually talk about the first question a bit more. So sexual assault on campus has been a really big problem for decades now. And I think that usually when we talk about these issues, we can talk about how the problem exists, but it's often hard to point at one particular group that's doing harm, that's outwardly doing harm. It's just a general culture that's promoting this toxic mentality. But I think, especially when you look at the Western thing, it's, at least to me, it's become fairly easy to point one group that is taking part in this culture. And while this doesn't represent everyone who is at fault here, it is one group that we can target with our future organizing, and that's Greek life, like fraternities and sororities. I think fraternities and sororities have a history of systemic sexism, especially fraternities, all male brotherhoods or whatever. The ideas and culture they promote within themselves are usually so toxic to the development of young males in university that it would be interesting to take a look at how stopping something like that from even functioning could potentially create more positive climates at university. Now, I bring this up solely because after the Western incident and a few incidents in the US at colleges that some of my friends go to, I have been looking into how fraternities are organized in North America. One headquarters in, for example, the United States, in like Boston or something, and those headquarters operate chapters in separate universities. Now, for example, at U of T, after this incident, there were several fraternity sororities that wanted to come out and speak out against the toxic culture of the fraternities at universities like Western and University of Massachusetts Amherst in the US. But they were not allowed to. They couldn't put out statements condemning those fraternity members. And that's because of a united front against this stuff. You can't condemn the actions of any fraternity brother, no matter how bad, unless your headquarters say okay to it. So it creates a culture of something similar to, and this might be a false analogy, but just in this limited scope, I think it's something similar to police. I think it's something similar in the sense that you can keep saying that, oh yeah, there are certain members who are good. Not all fraternity members are bad. Some of them have good intention. But the fact of the matter is, the way this institution is organized is inherently flawed. It's a sexist organization, and they will take each other's sides no matter how bad the actions are of some of their bad brothers or whatever. So I think when we look at future organizing against sexual assault on campus, we should definitely target fraternities and Greek life as a whole. I mean, even sororities have a history of being quite racist against people of color. They have quotas to fill in terms of their membership for people of color and natural students, and then they have toxic ideas of, yeah, you have to wear this and this and this. If you're not wearing this, you're not going to be allowed in the sorority. I speak from personal experience. I have a lot of friends who are involved heavily with Greek life, and they've been telling me about this over the last few weeks, which is how I've been able to build this case against these organizations. So yeah, I think that in future organizing against sexual assault, we should definitely target more overtly the idea of Greek life and how those groups are often, creating toxic mentality on campus, especially because a lot of people who move to Canada, North America, again, speaking from my experience as an international, they move here and they get extremely excited about the idea of joining a fad of sorority. It's all, oh yeah, they have really cool parties. It's how you can make friends. It's really, I saw Zac Efron in a fraternity in Bad Neighbors, and it looks really fun. But in reality, that's often not what they are. It's more likely to be a situation of a bunch of toxic men coming together and saying, yeah, what we're doing is right. It's cool. It's okay. And if one of us gets caught doing it, he's the bad one. None of us were egging him on 2 weeks in advance. None of us were saying, oh yeah, this party's going to be fun, bring the drugs. That's not something that they can recognize amongst themselves. And even if they do recognize it, as troops in U of T did, they're often not allowed to speak out against it because their headquarters in, Wisconsin said no. So yeah, I think that's something we should talk about in the future. On question 2 as well, for that, it's just a simple thing. It's easy to see why the government was keen to not allow voting on campus. I think that's because voting trends in the past have shown that students, especially in city centers like in Toronto, are more likely to vote not for the traditional parties. So, I mean, in terms of like representing democratic rights of students, I know in India we have a very rich culture of student unions being closely organized with political parties. So you have student unions where leaders from student unions often end up after they graduate running for government elections. It's a pretty common occurrence because student unions are linked to the workers' parties their parents are a part of, stuff like that. So I think having student unions and workers' unions more closely interacting can create a better system moving forward, where students who were like 21 and they're in their fourth years trying to find a job a year later have an avenue to also get involved with the union the second they graduate, and then they stay involved in a group of people, discuss ideas, and ensure that their rights aren't infringed on as they were in this election. Yeah, that's about it.
So yeah, those are really fantastic answers. I think number one, the big piece for me is that men have to start taking a more active involvement in dismantling patriarchy and misogyny. As Grace said in one of the kind of mandatory sessions, it was an entirely kind of female or female presenting group of people. I see that often. And I think, yeah, men have to be challenged and also have to step up, right? Like rape culture isn't going to cease unless men take accountability and ownership over their actions, and don't respond with kind of defensiveness and deflection, which I see among, kind of everyone from celebrities, kind of politicians, kind of corporate figures, but also, friends of mine. I've had long conversations where I'll bring up something that I think is very commonplace, particularly around the Me Too movement, and they'll be like, well, I can't do anything anymore. And, it's like, I step back and I think, okay, well, I could let that comment slide, or this is an opportunity for me to challenge someone to say, like, is that true, right? Like, have your rights or abilities been infringed in this movement, or have people that have committed sexual violence against others actually just, is that being called out and in some cases kind of legally pursued? So yeah, I think number one, men have to step up. In terms of number two, I think perhaps the kind of best way to go about that would be, and I don't know enough about it, but to kind of ensure that there is a legal mandate to have a certain number of polling stations within university campuses. I brought a bunch of my students and a bunch of students from the residence to vote this year, and the lineup was quite long. But it should be something that's kind of enshrined and not able to be left to the whim of a particular political party. Or Elections Canada, like typically I think they do operate at an arm's length from the governing party, so I'm not really sure what led to voting votes being reduced or moved from campuses, but I think hopefully that is not a permanent reality. In terms of number three, I've been thinking about this a little bit because we also are heavily invested in carbon intensive kind of infrastructure projects at U of T. There's been a bit of a movement to kind of understand the depth of investments that are being made by the institution, but so far those have been rebuffed. So a number of students, I think 1 or 2 years ago, filed a Freedom of Information request or series of Freedom of Information requests to actually determine what kind of projects the financial wing of the university is involved with. So what are the implications of that in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but also in terms of the kind of ethical piece with operating in indigenous nations, or operating kind of resource extraction projects internationally. And I do know that some of that information was never actually made public under the auspices that it was kind of a trade secret. So the university's financial department, I'm not really sure what it's exactly called, but basically the kind of investment wing of the university was able to block that request. But I do think, that's one of the pieces, is ensuring that the transparency that we all want to see from kind of actors more broadly is also implemented through the university. So best case scenario, you don't have to file FOIs to get that information, but if you do, so be it. But I think the other piece around this is also ensuring that the faculty are kind of implicated in this as well, right? Like Obviously, university faculty kind of occupy a large political spectrum, or they exist in a large political spectrum, but it isn't solely up to the university students to start to petition for these institutions to do better. I think the faculty also have to become far more involved than they are now. And certainly many of the faculty are stretched quite thin, but any sort of kind of radical reimagining of the university space has to be done in conjunction with the people that actually are paid by that institution. Otherwise, it's going to fall short. So yeah, I think that's, you know, students are certainly kind of need to be involved, but the faculty also have to step up. Yeah, in terms of organization, I think there are a lot of kind of great community-based groups that are doing this work already outside of university spaces. And certainly those groups are often more accessible for different kind of social locations or socioeconomic backgrounds. So in my experience, it's often been quite beneficial to actually leverage those kind of partnerships. So if you're doing anti-racism work, don't just do it on the university campus, but involve a kind of, let's say, Rexdale Legal Services, who's doing anti-eviction work, and how do you kind of create that kind of solidarity and movement across different institutions and different kind of spatial realities. So yeah, I think those are some thoughts on 133.
Okay, thank you. So we still have a few minutes left. So if somebody forgotten something along the way or would like to add something, now is your time. You can have a couple of minutes. Grace, you need it. You're fine. Okay, Mike.
Yeah, I think I'm all right as well.
Okay, what about you, Avril? Any final words? You're okay? All righty. So special thanks to all three of you, Grace, Avril, and Mike, and of course to Daniel, our technical producer in Toronto. Please consider being a supporter of Socialist Action newspaper, which we will send to you online. To fill out the form, just visit our website at www.socialistaction.ca. And if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to socialistactioncanada@gmail.com or just give us a call at 647-986-1917. And once again, if you like this show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. Before I tell you about next week's webcast, there's 3 events coming up that our listeners and our panelists might be interested in. The first is Toronto Solidarity with Sue Whitten people rally at Yonge and Dundas on Friday tomorrow at 5 p.m. That's Yonge and Dundas tomorrow at 5 p.m. And then SA Toronto, that's us, is hosting a picnic on Saturday at 2 p.m. at Wistful Park. And Wistful Park is located on Logan Avenue, 4 blocks south of Danforth, just 5 minutes from the Chester station on line 2. It's going to be a potluck with plenty of informal fun. So please come out and join us. There's Wistful Park Saturday at 2 p.m. And lastly, the next Monday, October the 4th at 12 noon, protests for profit long-term at Queen's Park. CUPE Ontario is the organizer. Join us on Monday to demand public quality long-term care. And also, folks, our next SA webcast will be on Thursday, October the 7th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on the topic Choice is Under Attack. Women Resist from Texas to Toronto to New Brunswick with speakers Lisa Lewin in Burke from Minneapolis, Minnesota, Rubina Chowdhury in Toronto, and Joyce Author in Vancouver, and Robbie Mahood in Montreal. So, comrades and friends, until next time, please be safe, stay healthy, stay active. Bye for now. Okay.